Iran Google Hangout on how to free a political prisoner. I'm so excited to be joined by some really incredible, interesting individuals. We have Jared here, who's a law professor, founder of Freedom Now, a nonprofit that works to free prisoners of conscience worldwide. Thank you for joining us. We have Yang. We're so excited to welcome Yang, who's a Chinese pro-democracy activist who was actually witness to the infamous Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. And after returning to China, was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in prison for spying. He was, in fact, freed by Freedom Now and the public outcry they were able to create around his release. So we're so excited to hear his story. Asil is also here, who works at the intersection of tech, politics, and human rights, was a Fulbright scholar and a Truman Fellow, and is doing some really amazing work. Miriam, lastly, is an activist, a writer, an editor, and a consultant and strategist working in the field of human rights and social change. She also founded Persian to English, which is a blog that exposes the human rights violations in Iran. So thank you guys so much for being here and for joining us for this. I think it's going to be a really great conversation. So I wanted to make sure that each person got a chance to sort of give a little bit more of their background. So maybe we can start with you, Jared. If you could sort of break down the process into a sequence of what the 5 steps are that it takes to free a political prisoner, and tell us just a little bit more about your work in that specifically.
Sure. Well, thanks to RYOT and to IHRDC. Sorry, I'm not sure if I got that acronym right, but the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center for setting this up. So, I mean, very, very briefly speaking, and this is a complex area of work that I've worked on for probably 15 years and counting, on dozens of cases, both personally and through my NGO Freedom Now. But in short, there are roughly 5 steps to securing the release of a political prisoner. The first is identifying the case that you want to be working on. You know, the overlay that we look at is, you know, we want to only represent people who are prisoners of conscience, people who are detained for who they are, what they believe, who have neither used nor advocated violence. You also want to have a sense of your ability to work on behalf of a family, because you don't want to work contrary to the intentions of the prisoner themselves or the family or their representation. And you also want to get a sense of, you know, what are the various leverage points with the country in question. So the first step is identifying the prisoner you want to represent, and also being confident that they've neither used nor advocated violence and that they're the right person to help. From there, you need to step back and really think about strategy. And we are really process experts, not country experts. And so the way we look at that question is, you know, we assemble a local team. It starts with the family of the person detained and their local counsel, to the extent that they have a local lawyer already. And then we look at identifying country experts in the country or internationally who can really help us understand the country. And then the question is, you know, what are the right steps of legal, political, and public relations advocacy that you're going to undertake, and in what sequence, to maximize the impact and to get the person out of prison. And so those are kind of steps 3, 4, and 5, although one goes back and forth between them. You know, legally speaking, can you take the case domestically? Will that work? Are there regional human rights courts? You know, can you take the case to the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention or other bodies? Political is about, you know, what leverage can you bring to bear on the country detaining a person, because at the end of the day, people are released, political prisoners are released when the costs substantially outweigh the benefits to the government detaining the person. And then public relations, is again about escalating the cost to the government in question. There are exceptions to the general rule that public relations helps. Sometimes, however, there are highly sensitive cases where private diplomacy is going to be the most effective way forward, and where PR can be counterproductive. And so, you know, you have to look at the specific facts and circumstances and tailor a strategy that works to achieve them. And lastly, I'll just say on freedom-now.org, you can see examples of about 25 or 30 cases and all the aspects of the campaigns that we've run, with the exception of those that are, of course, done privately and behind the scenes, and 25 or 30 active cases that we're working on. But it's been a tremendous honor and privilege for me to represent people like Yang Zhenli and others, and to stand in solidarity with them and their families as they are wrongly detained, and to achieve justice for them and to enable them to return to their important work.
Right, fascinating. Thank you so much. And you know, it would be really great right now to hear from you, Yang. You know, a little bit more about how it came to be that you were a political prisoner yourself, and also what do you think the single most important factor was in bringing about your release?
Yep. Thank you for having me here, and thank you, Jared, for your thoughts. And as Jared mentioned, I was in prison for 5 years. As I was imprisoned, Jared acted as international legal counsel to me and my family. He spearheaded international effort on my behalf effectively. And thanks to his effort and the pressure he helped generated, I received a relatively light sentence, 5 years. When the sentence was delivered, almost everybody was surprised because my case, I could have been sentenced to more than 15 years or even life imprisonment. My case is just a very good example to show how international effort can help a political prisoner and help to gain the freedom of political prisoner. And I think the few very important factors for my freedom. One is we need a person, an NGO, and a person like Jared Ganser, and an NGO like Freedom Now to commit themselves fully on the case. And number two, we need families' involvement. So nobody can tell the story, can represent the political prisoner better than the families. So my family, my wife and children did a wonderful job cooperating with Jared's team to mobilize my case around the world. And another thing is the team should be able to mobilize the high level of government, like White House, State Department, to raise the case to the government in question. In my case, China. So it took President Bush to raise my case 3 times to his Chinese counterpart, and the Secretary Paul of State once, and 3 times by Secretary Rice, and more than 60 times by U.S. ambassador to China. So usually it involves a high-level involvement from a country like U.S. And also the team should be able to mobilize international human rights mechanism, like human rights mechanism at UN. So I was denied to see my legal counsel in China for nearly 15 months until Jared submit my case to UN work group for arbitrary detention, and that group decided my case was arbitrary arrest. When that decision was made and delivered to Chinese government, only when that happened, the Chinese government agreed to let my legal counsel to visit me. So a legal counsel in China cannot do much more than just act as a messenger, which is very important. Before that, I was in the situation where I thought I had been all forgotten, all abandoned by family and friends. When my lawyer came to visit me in prison, he actually got a very important message from me, from international community, so that I knew outpouring support on my behalf. So I have a courage to continue my work even in prison, so which is very important. So I think I said too much already, and I would like to join later about my personal experience.
Sure. Well, I think this is a great opportunity to segue into the next question, which is basically about what is the role that social media, technology, and the international community can play in bringing about the release of a political prisoner? For Asil and Mariam, maybe this is a good one for you guys because you did say that the most important factor in your release, Yang, was this international pressure. So maybe the two of you can speak a little bit to the efficacy of this sort of international pressure and how we sitting at home in the U.S. at our computers can help in the release of someone like Yang.
Hi there. Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here and experience this with you. That's a very good question. Social media plays a very vital role in freeing a political prisoner or campaigning for a political prisoner, in the sense that nowadays all the media, journalists, and even politicians are on social media watching what people are doing. So the more people that are tweeting or Facebooking about a certain case, a human rights case, the more attention the media and the politicians will also give to that case. So what we do, for instance, is when we're working on a campaign, we try to do like tweet storms, which are these simultaneous actions that we take for like a span of an hour's time, and we tweet about a particular specific topic just for that hour, using a specific hashtag that we've created for that 1 hour. And the goal is to get as many people as possible to tweet on that hashtag, to get that hashtag to trend on Twitter in order to get the attention of the media, and also to get that hashtag on the homepage of Twitter, where millions of people are viewing it and would be exposed to that hashtag and ultimately the cause that we're advocating for.
Great, that's a really helpful answer. And how about you, Asil? I know you've consulted on stuff like this before and studied it quite a bit.
Yeah, so my background, just in terms of the work that I've done in this field, and again, thanks to Unlock Iran and RYOT for hosting this. I think more of these types of hangouts are valuable. The more we see democracy on the retreat in places where, a couple years ago we thought democracy was on the up and up. So my experience is mostly in Malaysia, where I've been working with the opposition there, particularly the opposition leader Anwar Ibrahim, who had spent 6 years in solitary confinement and may spend another 5 to 10 years in solitary confinement, depending on how things go over the next few weeks. So my role has largely been in terms of figuring out ways to use digital sort of media and technology to overcome some of the obstacles to democracy that are put in place in these places. Just a quick reference to William Dobson's book, The Dictator's Learning Curve, where he really documents in a very effective way the strategies that sort of semi-authoritarian governments are using to sort of display the accoutrements of democratic behavior, while in reality they continue to sort of operate very repressive regimes. And so getting around those, I think, need a pretty extensive toolkit, everything from traditional media outreach and traditional political outreach to sort of non-traditional disruptive stuff like social media. And my sort of what I've learned about social media in terms of what works, at least in our case in Malaysia, was number one, the authenticity of the messenger. So having an account or a team that's really tied to the issue. In this case, it's the principal person himself, who we convinced a couple of years ago, you need to start tweeting on your own. You can't have your office doing it. And he resisted initially, but eventually realized the value of establishing that personal one-to-one connection with people. In advance of, let's say, going into prison or going into incarceration, building up the authenticity of that messenger and that account, I think, is really valuable. The second thing I think is that it takes a lot of time to build up an audience. Moments like a day where there's a big rally and people are arrested, or the particular person himself is arrested. Those are times to sort of unleash social media, but in the weeks and months before that, you need to be working on building up your audience and building up a regular sort of audience of people connected. And one thing that we've seen with Facebook, particularly not so much Twitter, But as Facebook has gone more the way of monetizing their platform, it's harder and harder to reach all the people that you've built up in your audience. And so really the only way to do that without spending thousands and tens of thousands of dollars on Facebook is to regularly connect with your audience. That means, a content strategy that's not just sort of once every couple of days, but literally day after day after day, engaging with the audience and getting people to give their opinion. And then ultimately, I think where social media is most valuable is mobilizing support. I think the international community has a lot of things that they're focused on right now, and always there's crises and calamities and things going on all over the place. And if you can get people out on the street, if you can get people at demonstrations, and that's what makes news. And so I think social media has at its sort of very core is the ability to get online activity and mobilize people offline. So those would be my three points on social media.
Great, and thank you. And I have a question then. We'll start with you, Jared, on this, but I'd like to hear from Miriam and you again, Asil. What's been the greatest success story, your personal greatest success story in bringing about or helping to bring about a prisoner's release? And maybe give us some details about why they were imprisoned and what steps you took that really moved the needle on this.
Sure. Well, I mean, there are lots of different successes for a whole lot of different reasons. Each case is unique, and I mean, I've said, John Lee's heard me say this before, that to get him out of prison in China took literally 2,000 or 3,000 hours of work. Other cases against less powerful countries can be done, in dramatically less time, which I think is kind of a power of a model of focus, which John Lee emphasized. But I think it's worth emphasizing as well that there are many NGOs out there that do pieces of what Freedom Now does, and it's all very, very important. Nevertheless, it's the lack of focus, where you literally every day you wake up and you say, what am I going to do to help this person, and how do I sequence those activities to have the impact, where you're not able to get a person out more quickly because you're just distracted with so many other things. So I mean, I'll give you a couple of quick examples. We represented a Pakistani Christian who had a death sentence for blasphemy in Pakistan, a guy named Ayub Masih. And in his case, we pretty much got it done in about 100 hours of work. He was on death row. He was accused by his neighbor of having said, check out that book by Salman Rushdie. And that led to his imprisonment. We got involved at the 4.5, 5-year mark of the case because he was on final appeal to the Supreme Court, and an NGO in Lahore, Pakistan, reached out to us asking us to help. And so in his case, we took his case to the UN. This was post 9/11, so we didn't want to go public with the case except as a last resort because at the time President Musharraf was in charge. But practically speaking, so it wouldn't be good to try to put pressure publicly from the West on him to let this person out of prison. So we won the case at the UN, and from there we got a group of 12 U.S. senators, 9 of them on the appropriations subcommittee that gave away foreign aid money, to write privately to then General Musharraf. It was hand-delivered to him by the U.S. ambassador to Islamabad at the time. And within 6 weeks, the appeal was advanced to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court heard the case, and our domestic lawyer, presented the UN decision as well as other reasons why the decision wasn't compatible with Pakistani law and the Constitution. And they took a lunch break and reversed the conviction and acquitted him on all charges after lunch. And so start to finish, it was 100 hours of work over about a 6-month period of time, maybe a little bit longer than that, because it took time for the UN process to wend its way through. And we were able, in his case, he wanted to get out of Pakistan, and so we were able to get him a humanitarian parole to come to the United States, and we got him to a safe house in the middle of the night out of the prison. And Musharraf got this done quietly and privately, and it wasn't until years later that we actually talked about the case and what we had done to get him out of prison, because of course there were a lot of sensitivities there on the ground. I'll stop there because I know there are lots of other participants on the call, but that's just one good example of a case where, to say that it was gratifying is sort of the understatement of the century, to meet Ayub Masih at Dulles Airport in Northern Virginia, and to see him, come through immigrations and customs. And at the time, he only spoke a word of English, or a couple words of English. God bless you. But he was facing hanging by noose. And with 100 hours of work, we were able to get him not only out of prison, but out of Pakistan. And he lives in the United States, has political asylum here, and has the rest of his life in front of him. And so that was a great success, and one at the time that there was zero media attention on, or close to no media attention on. And so it's a great example of, with focus, what one can actually achieve.
Great. And I'd love to hear from you, Mariam or Asil, if either of you have worked on a case that turned out to be extremely successful and how that happened.
Yes, I mean, well, I'm sure other countries are like this too, but in Iran, for instance, where my focus is on calling considering what is considered a success story is very subjective, because sometimes you succeed to, I guess, get a prisoner released, but at the same time they're being harassed and threatened outside of prison, or their families are being threatened, or their family members get arrested, and then you have to start a new campaign for them. So that's very subjective in that sense. But the biggest success story that we have had up until now is arguably the Saeed Malikpour's case. Saeed Malikpour is a permanent resident of Canada who had visited Iran in 2008 to see his ailing father, who eventually died from a brain tumor. And he was arrested 3 days upon arriving to Iran by plainclothes forces, and he was kidnapped ultimately and tortured to confess on television to crimes that are not even technologically possible, to be honest with you. So anyway, he was put on death row twice, and we had to launch 2 campaigns to get him off death row. And we succeeded to stop the death sentence. However, his death sentence was converted to life in prison. And actually, funny enough, we're relaunching the campaign next month, which is his birthday on June 4th. And we're hoping that this new set of international pressure would at least allow him to get a furlough, a temporary prison leave, since he has not even received one since 2008 when he was arrested, and he doesn't have any of his prisoner rights either. And his case is under the tight control of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. So even his rights are not protected under prison jurisdiction. So for us to get his death sentence called off when the Iranian cyber army was attempting to use him as an example to inflict fear onto civil society and get them too scared, I guess, to go online on the global internet and communicate openly. So that was a very big success story for us. Another one was in December 2010, I believe it was. We had a 48-hour campaign going to save somebody from death row, Habib Latifi, a Kurdish political prisoner. And in Iran, ethnic minorities are executed very, very easily. We stayed up for 48 hours, and we succeeded to stop his death sentence with the help of a very extensive campaign and the help of Iranians inside the country who actually protested outside the prison. Unfortunately, though, once we saved his life, the next day, the Iranian regime secretly executed 2 other political prisoners in retaliation. So success is subjective in these cases.
Yes, of course. And Asil, did you have anything to add to that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess the only success story I can speak to is the fact that Anwar Ibrahim has not gone back to jail in the last couple of years. He was charged in 2008, you know, on charges that are viewed as being politically motivated, and was surprisingly young, almost like you were surprised, was surprisingly acquitted in 2012 by the court. I think that these acquittals and these convictions and these sentencings have a lot to do with the level of threat that the regime may feel and the level of pressure that they may feel that may come both domestically and internationally. So I think at that time we had been successful in ratcheting up the pressure and making them feel like there was more to lose than there was to gain by putting somebody of his stature behind bars. Now I may eat my words in a few weeks if he ends up in jail. So the verdict is out on that one. No pun intended.
Right. I'd love to transition now, if possible. Mr. Yang, it would be really great if you could just share with us your story, what it was like being in Tiananmen Square, how you were able to get asylum in the U.S., and then what happened upon your return that led to your arrest. We'd love to get that backstory.
Okay, I try to be brief, as brief I can. When Tiananmen movement took place in the spring of 1989, I had been in US for 3 years already as a graduate student of mathematics at UC Berkeley. And I went back to join the movement and took back money I collected here to support the student on the ground. And uh, on the 3rd of June, that I have been there for a few weeks. And as I got there the second day after the martial law was declared. So a couple of weeks after the martial law was declared, the Chinese government decided to open fire and send troops and tanks to Tiananmen Square. And I witnessed the massacre. I stayed in on the spot for nearly 10 hours, saw about more than 30 people killed. And I saw with my own eyes tanks ran over students, and 11 students were killed on the spot. And Mr. Fang Zheng, who now is living in San Francisco, lost his both legs ran over by a tank. He pushed a girl to a sidewalk, and he himself did not escape soon enough and was run over and lost both his legs. He was luckier than the another 11 students who were killed on the spot. And I escaped China 2 days after the massacre. Because I returned from the United States, I had a passport, which was a privilege at that time to ordinary Chinese citizens. And I had a US visa to escape China. And that when I escaped, the airport was a chaotic situation where the police did not try to stop anybody, because the police also protested against the government massacre at that time. So I was able to escape. And the day after I was escaped, the government issued a wanted list. So I was very lucky escaped that. And ever since then, I worked on the daily basis to try to advance human rights in China. I helped found a few organizations. And of course, I was on the blacklist, barred from return to China. In 2002, the labor movement broke out all over China, and I tried to go back to help them with nonviolent struggle strategies, a topic I had been writing extensively and advocated relentlessly. And I wrote a few articles for them, and one of the leaders of the labor movement called me and asked me to help them more, and I decided to go back. But my passport had been expired, and I had tried twice to get renewed but rejected. And I entered with a friend's passport, and I went to the northern part of China to help the movement there. And I got arrested while seeking to leave China, and later sentenced to 5 years in prison. But when I first got there, I was kept in solitary confinement for nearly 15 months. That is what I talked about. During these 15 months, I was not allowed to see anybody. No outside information, no book to read, and no paper and a pen to write. And I was so anxious, almost collapsed. And I could not help thinking that my family had already abandoned me, friend forgotten me, and I tried. Now I began to lose hope, and so in that situation. But one day I tried to remember a very long English word. I found that I couldn't. So I was very worried that I would lose my memory altogether. So I began to write poems in my head to exercise my brain as much as I can. In that way, I wrote more than 100 poems. And you know, until I didn't get to talk to anybody except my interrogators until the day when Jared and many friends in the U.S. helped the UN working group to come up with that decision, and also the both houses passed a resolution on my behalf. And with that pressure, Chinese government finally agreed to let my legal counsel to visit me in prison. Until then, I did not know so much support in the internet support, in that community on my behalf. So I really encouraged, regained my courage to continue my work. Even in prison, I helped a lot of prisoners to protect their rights. Without the news that the friends are helping me outside, I didn't even have no courage to do anything like that. So I always tell friends that the help from international community is so important for prisoners. Now I'm a free man, so I work very closely with Jared Ganser for other political prisoners in China. But China is the most difficult country, and but we are determined to continue our work.
It might rival Iran, although it's worth noting Jean Lee is too modest to say this, but I do want to say this. He actually was offered early release at around the 2-year mark. We were able to help get him a much lower sentence. I mean, he was facing life in prison or even a death penalty, and they gave him the minimum sentence under the law that they could give with a conviction, which was 5 years. But around the 2-year mark, he and I'll tell this story, Jean Lee, not force you to, but they told to release him, and they said, we're taking you to the airport now. And he said, well, look, I'm not going to sign any confession, and this is what historically dissidents in China would have to do, in exchange for their freedom, is to sign a confession. And he told them that very clearly, and they brought him to the airport, and he met there the political officer of the U.S. Embassy, because he was going to be going back to the United States, where his wife and children lived. And he was literally on the tarmac at the airport, and the Chinese government said, well, of course, you're going to have to sign this confession. And he said, well, I told you I'm not going to sign a confession. And there was then a debate between the Chinese government officials and the U.S. government official about, can you make this guy get on the airplane? And, the political officer said, well, that's not how we do things. If he won't get on the airplane voluntarily, there's nothing that we can do. And and then they gave Jean Lee an ultimatum and said, well, you either sign this or you're going back to prison. And Jean Lee said, take me back to prison. He was offered early release an additional time as well, which they were smart enough not to take him back to the airport. But as a matter of principle, Jean Lee wasn't going to confess to something that he didn't do. And I think it's important to emphasize that point, because I think that Miriam and Asel both talked about this, and I've had the same experience, where particularly prisoners of conscience are, of course, people of principle and people with convictions and with courage that few of us, I think, can marshal. As a result, they tend not to leave prison and decide to go passive. They tend to remain engaged in politics and political advocacy, and that can get them in trouble repeatedly. So unfortunately, we've had recidivist clients, as I jokingly refer to. Some of my friends have been to prison multiple times, and so it's not unusual to see someone who stays in their country of origin be persecuted by the government again. But it is my view and my experience that by standing in solidarity with these people and then raising the stakes for detaining them dramatically, that you can make it much more challenging even for authoritarian governments like a China or Iran or a Malaysia, as hard as those countries can be, at least the first two more than the third. But Iran and China are two of the toughest countries in the world in which to work on political prisoner cases. But you can even influence the calculus of governments like that by being relentless and focused and determined and being highly strategic about how you operate.
Absolutely. That's so
Molly,
fascinating.
I was going to jump in and say one thing about social media that I forgot to mention earlier, which is that at least in my experience, and Jan, your story, every time I hear it gives me goosebumps, especially those critical moments. One thing that social media has done for at least the folks that I work with is, these are people who have principles, and these are people who are kind of larger than life in terms of their courage and their willingness to confront huge risks, and yet they are still human. And the support that they get and that their families get means a great deal in keeping them committed to the cause and feeling like it's all worth it in the end. So I can see the value of not only being able to attract large crowds in person, but to be able to muster large crowds that send good energy to the person or their family or their close friends who are probably also risking a fair amount just by being a part of the cause. And I think that's one of the untangible, I mean, you can't really put a value on a like or a retweet or something like that, but I think at a personal level, it means a whole lot to be able to see that stuff.
Of course. And, Mr. Yang, what would your advice be to the family or friends of someone behind bars right now for their activism? Someone who is in that position.
Yeah, family can play a very, very important role, maybe a critical role in release a political prisoner. First of all, the only family member can tell the most most moving story to whoever can help, who can touch people most. And number two, the political prisoner, when they kept isolated from outside world, the thing they worry most is their family members, and worry whether they will abandon him or not, things like that. So if the political prisoner learned that their family firmly stand behind him or her, so that make the whole thing so different. So that otherwise the prisoner will can easily, no matter how strong the person is, can easily begin to doubt whether what they have done worth what they did, all things like that. And I can family can be very, very important for the political prisoner. And in my case, my wife and my children worked very closely with Jared Ganser. They lobbied all the way to the White House to mobilize the both houses of the Congress to pass a resolution on my behalf. And at the same time, the Chinese authorities, the jailers, understand equally well how the important role the family can play. So they kept giving me wrong information about my family, my parents, my children, and my wife. And one time they even hinted that my 6-year-old boy was in custody. So that almost make me collapse. So they applied such psychological torture on political prisoners because they understand that family are so important to the political prisoners. So I always tell my friends, families who are the friends in prison, that you have to stand very firmly behind the prisoner and do whatever you can to support. So I really appreciate Jared effort. That's actually almost the second day I was arrested. He approached my wife to convince my wife to work all out together with him for my freedom.
And it was, I think that one of the things that John Lee is referencing, but is important to emphasize, is the challenge for political prisoners' families in figuring out who they can trust in these kinds of situations. Because everybody has a political reason, it seems. Some are eminently charitable, like Freedom Now, because we're an NGO, but others have political agendas, right, that they're trying to undertake. And usually it's the dissident themselves that's imprisoned, and in some cases the families are political as well, but in most cases they're not, in my experience. And as a result, they don't have any real way of judging who's someone we can trust, who can't we trust, do we go public, do we not go public, how do we resolve this situation? And the first, couple of weeks is the most challenging time, I think, for families to kind of get their bearings and start to figure out who to trust. And even when they, even people who are well-meaning, who work on the country, I mean, I'll give an illustration. In, Yang Zhanli's case, there were a number of people who were very, very well-meaning. Zhanli is of the Han ethnic majority extraction, but he's always been very inclusive about the need to address and to have a single China with, ethnic and religious rights respected, as well as geographical rights. And so, there were very well-meaning, for example, Tibetans that wanted Christina, his wife, to come speak at a rally on Tibet, because Zhanli was a strong supporter of Tibet autonomy within a one China. And it was, I think it took a little time for his wife to understand that, once your husband is in prison, even if he's about advancing all these other rights for China and the rights for political prisoners to be free, actually the family's focus has to be exclusively on getting their loved one out of prison and actually not on the broader agenda. And ironically enough, while before Zhanli speaking at a Tibet event would be eminently reasonable, appropriate, and very useful for the cause in the broadest sense, having his wife go speak at a rally on Tibet didn't actually advance his freedom, because the Chinese government has major issues with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, in my view, ridiculously unfairly. But at the end of the day, the family needs to be aware of how the activities that they're undertaking, even by people who are, very reasonable, and these Tibetan activists who wanted her to speak, completely, didn't really give any thought to anything other than the fact that he was always supportive of them, and therefore they thought that they could help her by having her come and speak. And it turns out that actually in the case when he's now detained, that's actually not a helpful thing to do to advance his freedom. And so we really had to focus the family like a laser beam on the need to secure his freedom, and then figure out who are the messengers that the Chinese are going to actually listen to. Right? They're not going to listen to the Uyghurs and the Tibetans and people from Hong Kong lobbying them. They're going to listen to the UN. They're going to listen to the US. They're going to listen to the UK, or at least they're going to hear what all these bodies have to say, and that's going to be actually a lot more persuasive, right? And speaking to the mainstream media directly rather than through others. And and so this is very, very complex stuff. And I think this is one of the challenges in our fast-moving world, is to make sure that whoever is working with any family in this situation can really put in the time that's necessary to get the job done well, rather than just kind of come in and out of a case as they see fit. Because the only way to get this done well, I mean, ironically enough, and the last thing I'll say is, the same set of activities, let's say winning the case at the UN, having an op-ed in a newspaper, and having a press conference on Capitol Hill. Those three activities, if you sequence them over 3 months, one a month, will have very little effect on a government, right? But if you time them to all happen at the same time intentionally, where you win the case at the UN, you have a press conference on Capitol Hill the same day, and an op-ed in the Washington Post, the government is going to notice and is going to pay attention. And so what you need to do is you actually have to mobilize the ebbing and the flowing of the pressure on a government so that they actually take notice and so that it has an effect. And this is why the work is so hard, and why you have to be very, very strategic and thoughtful about the choices that you make and how you work on these individual cases.
Right, amazing. And speaking of individual cases, I think I'd love you guys to each take the opportunity to talk about any cases that you're working on now, that you can disclose the details of course, that you want to tell our viewers to watch out for, and to participate in if they can. Maybe we start with you, Miriam, because it would also be great for you to sort of touch on, with a country like Iran, which you're dealing with, where there are hundreds of political prisoners, how do you bring attention to individual cases and not just have the online community be lost in this sea of information about all of the hundreds of cases?
Thank you. It's definitely a challenge to raise awareness on Iranian political prisoners. Number one, because when you live in a Western country where you have a lot more freedom than, let's say, a closed society, when you hear the word prisoner, the very first thing you think is, well, they must have committed some type of crime or broken the law in that country. Now, we may not consider that a crime, but in that country they do, and thus, we should respect the laws in that country. But people need to understand that a lot of these cases, the prisoners of conscience are just regular people, or they're activists or students or children's rights activists, and their only crime is speaking out. And communication is the biggest threat to a dictator. So a campaign that we're working on right now to develop is the Saeed Malikpour campaign, which we're hoping to launch on June 4th, which is the day of his birthday. And he's been locked up in Evin prison since 2008. So we're hoping that the pressure will sort of get him a furlough, prison leave, and then we can go from there. Now, I just wanted to give people a little piece of advice on how they can support prisoners like Saeed Malikpour, or prisoners in China, or any prisoner who is detained in a closed society. A lot of the time, dictators, in order to continue their suppression tactics and so forth, they need to create chaos and confusion surrounding the cases. And when they do so, it limits the amount of support those cases get and receive. So a lot of NGOs, for instance, if there's too many loopholes around a case, or if they have a hard time contacting the family members or really accessing the information in their case file, they sort of shy away from those types of cases. And unfortunately, that prisoner does not get enough support. So one tactic that we employ always is we don't allow the distractions to stop us or to confuse us. What we do at all times is focus on the basic human rights that are being violated. So for instance, Saeed has been charged for moderating pornographic websites, more than one website. And they have no evidence against Saeed except his hours of false confessions, which he gave under torture. So a lot of the times when people want to come support Saeed, or they have questions to ask us, they say, well, what if he did commit a crime? And I say to them, you know what? We're not here to figure out whether a prisoner is innocent or guilty. We're here to make sure that their prisoner rights are being respected and due process is being followed. So in most cases of prisoners of conscience, their prisoner rights are not being respected or followed. They don't have access to a lawyer. They do not get visitation rights. They do not get even phone rights. So it's important to just focus on the basics. And if we continuously, repeatedly send out the message that these prisoners have not received their basic prisoner rights, that will corner that regime the most out of anything. Corner them to answer the most obvious questions and keep it basic and simple, and you will receive the best results.
I do want to, offer an alternative view, because, I can appreciate the value of that approach in some cases, but, we don't shy away from addressing the ridiculous charges that get thrown at our clients head on, because, the best lies are those that are told with a grain of truth to them, and so we will, we have had clients that we've represented in places like a Turkmenistan or Uzbekistan, which are more, sophisticated, in quotes, totalitarian regimes where they don't charge people with offenses like undermining national unity or violating national security. They just plant weapons in somebody's trunk and say that they had illegal weapons, or plant drugs on them and say they were a drug dealer. And so we will marshal the evidence to actually demonstrate as conclusively as humanly possible the person's history and background as a journalist. For example, in one of our Turkmen cases where weapons were found in the trunk, the two detainees in this case watched actually as the police planted the weapons in their trunk, and we marshaled testimonial evidence from their colleagues with major international news organizations saying that these people have never picked up a weapon in their entire lives and otherwise. And so, although mainstream human rights groups took a while to come around to getting engaged because of the charges that were against them, we felt it's critically important to address the question of, weapons planted in the trunk, or as you were mentioning, Miriam, alleged pornography charges, or, coerced confessions, which are completely bogus. And I do think that, you have to come at the substance of what the dictators are saying and pin them down and pin them up against a wall. And when you have, highly detailed facts and evidence from other people who know these people well, then you can marshal a case that takes it right back to the dictator. But I wouldn't necessarily, and I'm not saying you're suggesting this, but one has to just be careful to not address the substance because, of course, everybody, as a lawyer, I would say everyone deserves due process of law. But when it comes to mobilizing political support on a person's behalf, there is much less interest in supporting someone who is merely a victim of due process abuses, because due process abuses happen in the United States, they happen, in the UK, they happen everywhere in the world. And so lots of people are wrongly imprisoned, but there's a more narrow subsegment of people who are wrongly imprisoned who are political prisoners, which of course is our topic of discussion today, who are extra deserving of help and political pressure and a whole range of other support, not merely because they're wrongly detained, but because they're detained for who they are or what they believe. And so yes, they're of course also victims of due process violations, but I think that it's really helpful and valuable to tell their story and to directly confront a regime's lies as best as humanly possible, even if sometimes they make it very hard with coerced confessions or otherwise.
Sure, of course. And do you have any current cases that you're working on that we can get involved in or that we should be looking out for?
Well, I mean, I think the hardest case that I'm working on, and I'm working with Yang Zhenli on, is the case of Liu Xiaobo, who won the 2010 Nobel Peace Prize. I was actually introduced to Liu Xia, his wife, by Zhenli, who is a fellow intellectual of Liu Xiaobo's, and they knew each other going back to Tiananmen Square. And Freedom Now and I began representing Liu Xiaobo about 2 or 3 months before he won the Nobel Peace Prize. That is about the hardest political prisoner case in the world today, because the Chinese government is not only detaining him, and they've sentenced him to 11 years in prison for subversion, but since a week after he won the Nobel Peace Prize, and because of their strong pushback against it, they've placed his wife, Liu Xia, under house arrest. She's been there for more than 3 years. In our submissions to the UN and their response, they've claimed that she isn't even under house arrest, which of course she is, and she's under immense pressure. Her brother has been sentenced to 11 years in prison on false economic offenses charges. And few governments in the world, including major world powers, have any interest in standing up to China. So I mean, we've had major problems even with the United States, who you'd hope and think might want to care or do something about this. But President Obama, who's a Nobel Peace Laureate himself, declined to sign on to a letter from 134 Nobel laureates across all 6 disciplines that we put together. The White House has never publicly said that Liu Xia is under house arrest or even called for her release, even though we've repeatedly asked them to do so. So if there was one case that I would say deserves the attention, it's Liu Xiaobo's case. And it's not merely, and I mean, in all these cases, I'm speaking about the prisoner themselves because I'm the lawyer representing those people. But really, it's all of the cases that I take up are symbolic of broader abuses in a country. It may well be that Liu Xiaobo is well known by name, and some people may think, oh, well, he's a Nobel Peace Laureate, he has all the help he needs, or otherwise. But ironically enough, in his case, much like with other dissidents in China, he doesn't have all the help he needs. In fact, most people are self-censoring, most governments are self-censoring to not raise the case because they know China is so hypersensitive to it. And ironically enough, if you think about it, right, if Liu Xiaobo's wife, Liu Xia, can be placed under house arrest with impunity for more than 3 years, if the government of China can publicly lie and say that she's not even under house arrest and get away with it, not have anyone call them out as lying, other than us and human rights NGOs, but no governments are calling them out as lying, then imagine what it's like to be a dissident in China who's just an activist in your community who gets detained by the police. And we see, sadly, the Chinese government using, on other China cases, these high-profile cases as a sword to repress other dissidents. So we represent a disappeared Chinese human rights lawyer named Gao Zhisheng, whose wife and kids live in the U.S., and we've done some very high-profile things to put pressure to get him out of prison in far western China. But he has been horrifically tortured. His wife and kids were tortured while they were in China until they got out. But today, as we speak in China, when they arrest a local lawyer who's taking up a political case and they're torturing them, they say to them, the case of Gao Zhisheng. He's a prominent human rights lawyer. You know about his case, right? His wife and kids are in the United States. They travel to Washington all the time. And there's nothing that they can do to help him. We can disappear him. We can torture him with impunity. And there's nothing that can be done. Imagine what we can do to you and your family. And so to my mind, this is precisely why we need to stand up on this these highest profile cases, like a Liu Xiaobo, Liu Xia, like Yao Zhisheng, and we need to stand in solidarity with these people. We need to press our respective governments to actually take meaningful action to support these people and to secure their release from prison.
Right, of course. That's really fascinating. And it would be great to have all this information. I know we'll get it up on the Google Plus Hangout page once this is all wrapped up, so people can follow up and get more information. And also, maybe you have, just a couple other wrap-up action items that we can all do with anything you're working on.
Well, I just probably reiterate what Jared said, which is there's nothing, I guess, more disheartening from the standpoint of civil society activists working in the trenches in places like China or Pakistan or Iran or Malaysia to have, on the one hand, Western governments talk a big game about democracy and freedom, but then to willingly engage with leaders of those semi or blatantly repressive governments on issues that range from national security to trade and investment interests, and completely ignore the human rights issues that are at stake. I think if there's something that people who are listening can take away from this is to challenge their, particularly those in democratic systems, to challenge their elected representatives to say that, yeah, trade and investment is fine, but let's have a balanced approach to dealing with these situations and not simply just throw under the bus people who are risking life and limb for principles that are really very much enshrined in the very fabric of what the United States stands for, and to be open about engaging on those things. So.
Of course. Well, thank you. We're out of time now, but thank you so much, you guys, for sharing your thoughts on this. It's such a fast topic and one that RYOT tries to cover as much as possible and try and create action around. So thank you, everyone who joined us, especially you guys, Jared, Asel, Miriam, Junli. Thank you so much. You guys can follow all of these guys on Twitter. Follow RYOT News, and we've just tweeted at all of them, so you can find them there. And again, we'll have all this information up on the Google Plus Hangout page if you want more information. Thank you again for joining, and I'll talk to you guys soon, I hope.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Bobby.
Thanks for hosting.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Good to see you.